Good morning. Now that we've successfully navigated the art of getting into the lecture theatre, successfully we can start. Firstly, a welcome to St Anne's College at the University of Oxford. Welcome to those of you that have travelled today. Some of you came yesterday, so you've had a bit of an experience already of seeing what Oxford's like in the evening. You've got an intense day and a half ahead of you. On the basis of feedback from the last 4 of these, hopefully you'll enjoy it and find it challenging in equal measure. It's a great opportunity to do the obvious things of delving more deeply into what it's like to be at Oxford or Cambridge, not just how to apply, and I'll run through that in a bit more detail in a minute. But more just for you to talk to people in a similar position from other similar schools about your hopes and fears about the whole process. And you've got lots of opportunities to ask questions and to delve more deeply into the various things that interest you. But just to get a sense, firstly, of where you are in that process. How many of you have already decided pretty categorically that Oxford or Cambridge is going to be one of the places on your UCAS list? How many of you are in that position already? So a majority, but not everybody. Okay, thank you. How many of you have decided on the subject? Absolutely, without any question. Okay, almost everybody, but not everybody. So I suppose the first question I want to ask has already been answered in your minds, but I guess it's worth rehearsing for the few of you that aren't yet fully decided, because this conference is really, firstly, about justifying an application to Oxford or Cambridge and encouraging people who are sort of teetering on the edge of that decision to make that decision to apply to Oxford or Cambridge. I suppose the first question is, why, when you decide on your up to 5 choices in most cases, on your UCAS form, why you should apply to either Oxford or Cambridge, make that one of your 5 choices. And underlying that, I suppose, is another question, which is, why do we think of Oxford and Cambridge to the extent that we do as a separate category of universities from all the other really great universities that are going to be on your list? You're not going to be lacking in choice of fantastic places to apply to for your particular subject or combination of subjects. Why do we think of Oxford and Cambridge to such an extent as different and separate, to the extent that we call it Oxbridge as one single category? Well, I suppose one answer to that is that by any sort of measure, Oxford and Cambridge rank among the world's leading universities. However you want to measure them, Oxford and Cambridge are there among the top, literally handful of universities. There are others in the UK that feature a bit further down, and there are lots of great universities in other countries as well that we might want to think about. But Oxford and Cambridge do stand out in any of these lists. And world-class is a phrase that's overused, isn't it? It's a bit like inflation. You go from good to excellent to outstanding. What's above that? How can you try and distinguish yourself even beyond that? And people talk about world-class this or world-class that. In this sense, this means something. It's actually a truth to say that Oxford and Cambridge are literally world-class. If you take the Times Higher Education Supplement reputation rankings that they produce every year, and these are based on asking academics from across the world which universities they rate most highly, how would they rank them. So you're asking professional academics, subject specialists around the world, and year on year Cambridge and Oxford come very close to the top. Notice that it's otherwise completely dominated by US universities. Last year Cambridge and Oxford were second and third. It just fluctuates. And normally Harvard is first. But that's okay, because Harvard was founded by people from Cambridge. And it was founded 425 years after Cambridge was founded. And Oxford was founded even earlier. These are incredibly venerable institutions. But I suppose the other thing worth noting is that for many, many of those centuries, Oxford and Cambridge weren't just the only universities in this country, but they weren't the powerhouses of intellectual endeavour that they are now. It's only recently, really, in the last 150 years, that we've come to talk about universities in the sense that we understand them. Previously, they were rich, yes, they were very privileged, yes, the people that were graduates of these universities became very powerful, but as centres of intellectual excellence, They left something to be desired. That's relatively recent, I suppose. Now, obviously, depending on how you want to rank them, Cambridge will be above Oxford in some lists, the other way around in other lists. These rankings are based on lots of different measures. It might be student-teacher ratios, it might be on the amount of research that's published, it might be on expenditure per student, it might be on student popularity. Lots of different measures, so of course you get different kinds of metrics and different kinds of lists, but the list tends to be quite stable in the names that appear. But you do start to get the names of other British universities on lists like this, like UCL in London, Imperial in London, and you've in the last few years started to get some European universities like the Federal Institute of Engineering in Zurich. But again, it's dominated by American universities on the whole, but Oxford and Cambridge tend to stand out. Now, sorry, I ought to say with reference to US universities, before we specifically look at Cambridge and Oxford, that it is worth just thinking about, if you haven't already done so, are any of you thinking about American universities? Okay, a few. Now, it's worth thinking about for a number of reasons. Traditionally, it's been hugely expensive compared with UK universities. That difference is getting less now because higher education in the UK is getting more expensive. But the gap is narrowing, and it's worth considering too that there are lots of scholarships and bursaries available for international students at many of these Ivy League universities. They tend to be different in their nature too. They're 4 years rather than 3, and they're usually liberal arts based, which doesn't mean just art subjects because it includes science and maths as well. But liberal arts means you start with a fairly broad base and then narrow. So if for any reason you are not totally committed to one subject, that you want to begin and drop everything else as of the time that you leave school, then it's worth considering as an option. Now, of course, if you've got a subject in mind and you look online at the various university rankings, those rankings don't always show Oxford and Cambridge at the top. They vary. These two I took at random. One of the subjects that I've chosen here is a thought-leading, cutting-edge science. The other is physics. The rankings will vary, and there will be some surprises. So look at those carefully for your subject when you do the research, because it's not always the usual suspects. And quite importantly, it's not always the ones your parents would expect to see. Because a lot of you will be talking about this to your parents, as well as to your teachers at school, as well as doing your own research. And the problem with parents, and I speak as one, is that there's a tendency to think in terms of your own experience. So I tend to think in terms of kind of league tables from when I was a student, and it's important to be clear that those do change. So for instance, on the geography list, Lancaster appears, and 10, 20 years ago it wouldn't have been there. So keep options open, keep open minds, and make sure that the people that you're talking to on the journey are also up to date with the information that they need to help you. So when you choose your university, what criteria are you going to use? Obviously, you're going to look at the subject and the details of the subject. You're going to look perhaps at the accommodation. Can the place that you want to apply to offer you accommodation? Is that important? It will vary. The feel of the place, and that's why open days are quite important. That's why this weekend is quite important. Some of you, I think, were in Cambridge yesterday for the open day and have looked around other universities. Getting a sense of the feel of the place is really vital. All of those are important. And I guess the thing about Oxford and Cambridge in that mix is that there are some very distinctive features about the experience that you'd have that are worth considering. The first is simply the quality of the resources. These are universities which, by definition, have cutting-edge resources by way of libraries and laboratories. The stuff that you'd have at your fingertips is amazing. Other universities have cutting-edge stuff as well, but the sheer scale of the opportunities here are worth considering. The other aspect of it that's different, very distinctive, even from the Russell Group universities that you'll be considering, is the structure of the teaching and the accommodation that takes place in a college environment. Now, Durham is the other university in the country that has a collegiate system. So you apply to a college, you'd apply to St Anne's, or another college here in Oxford, or in Cambridge. And this is where you would live. Probably in the college you may have the option second, third year to move out. But this is where you live, this is where you'd eat, this is where you'd make your initial friends. Most of the big teaching, the lectures, take place in the university departments of the subjects that you're studying. But this is the place that you'd have sort of first allegiance to, and that's quite interesting. You may or may not like that kind of community structure. The teaching is really very distinct here as well, because Cambridge and Oxford can afford to maintain a very small scale of teaching experience. Yes, there are lots of big lectures, yes, there are lots of laboratory experiences for scientists and so on, but the core of the teaching is in college with the maybe 3 or 4 or 5 students doing your course, with the Director of Studies in Cambridge College or a tutor in an Oxford college, and those weekly meetings are the core of your study. They literally direct your study, and they become extremely important as a means of opening up the subject. But those small group teaching structures are not found in everywhere else in the UK university system. It's worth considering. And one aspect of that is that you have access to the top subject experts in your subject. There are obviously lots of them around different universities. One of the differences in Oxford and Cambridge is that they do a lot of teaching as well. The teaching, the supervision isn't just done by graduate students, it's done by experts who don't just research. They take their teaching really seriously. And that's another sort of direct line into the sort of subject interest that hopefully has already inspired you to think about applying. So there are lots of differences. One of the things about Oxford and Cambridge is that it successfully, I think, mixes the modern with the traditional. Yes, there's loads of cutting edge stuff in every discipline. You'll get access to the cutting edge machinery, equipment and library research. But it's got that good mix of being a little bit quaint and old-fashioned and a bit odd as well. That picture on the left is quite distinctive. In Cambridge, normally when you get your results at the end of the year or at the end of your 3 years, you go and, traditionally you probably go online now, but you go and look at the notice boards outside the Senate House and see whether, it's all public, you see whether you got a first or a 2-1 or a 2-2, or something less than that. In Cambridge, if you don't quite get a third-class degree, you get something called a special degree, which actually sounds quite good, doesn't it? But the mathematicians always consider themselves a little bit different, and so do the rest of us. The mathematicians have their results announced in the way that's shown in that picture. Basically, they stand there in the Senate House, and then this chap in the fancy dress at the top goes up with a pile of loose-leaf degree results, name by name by name, with the degree classification on them, and just chucks them over the edge. And this undignified scramble to find out whether you've passed or failed is really quite character building. So, why hesitate? Surely it's a no-brainer. If you really are interested in your subject and you really want to learn it at an inspiring place, why hesitate to add? That's all you're doing, just adding Oxford or Cambridge to a list of 4 others. One of the reasons why people hang back, I suppose, is the perception that it's really quite hard work, that it's really intense. And some of the messages that come from admissions tutors at universities like this is that it is incredibly hard work, because they're trying to choke off sort of unnecessary demand. They just want the people who are really committed. I think it is, I mean, it's true to say it's hard work, it's true to say that it's very intensive. They're very short terms, they're 3 8-week terms, they're very intense. But all of the evidence, all of the alumni that we talk to and that will come to your schools and talk to, all the evidence that you can get from students like yourselves who come from schools like yours is that it's not out of proportion to what has made you successful already. It's a step up, yeah, but that's the intellectual challenge, that's the excitement, that's the great thing. It's the great thing that led you from year 6 to year 7, it's the great thing that led you from GCSE to A-level. It's another step up, but it is well within the range of your experience in a school like the one that you are currently at. And yes, there's lots of time for interests and activities and enthusiasms and fun as well. So take the hard work stuff with a pinch of salt. Yes, it is, but then you're here because you've been working hard and successfully for several years. So another reason why you might hesitate is that there is a perception that there are a lot of upper-class twits at Oxford and Cambridge. Yes, there are a few, Some of them go on to have leadership battles in various political parties. And they're mostly men, it has to be said. There are a few, and it's quite funny, but they generally keep themselves to themselves. They don't bother other people, on the whole. It's when they leave that they start bothering other people. You'll find people like you. You'll find people who share your interests, share your enthusiasms. And if you want to find different kinds of people, you'll find them as well. What struck me as a student, coming from a school that really didn't send people to university, let alone to Oxbridge, was just how counterintuitive it was, how unlike this it was, how meritocratic it was. And I think it really is true to say that you go to Oxford or Cambridge now and you can't rest on your laurels. It really doesn't matter which school you came from, which family you come from, what your name is or who you know. It matters what you're doing now and how you approach that. And that really is important. You'll find that it's a real meritocracy. Having said that, I don't know whether you can recognise the person number 7 on that list. I'm not sure how many years I'll be able to use this picture now. This might be the last year. But do anyone recognise the one number 7? George Osborne. Now, you will meet that type, and you can identify them possibly by their hairstyle, if it is a hairstyle. You can identify them by the odd sort of socky, shoey thing he's doing there. And the only thing that I would counsel is that beware slightly, because they sometimes come armed. But they are not representative of people at this university or at Cambridge. So, I suppose finally the question is the reason why people hesitate sometimes that genuine fear that unless they're absolutely sure of a result, they don't want to take the risk that they'll fail? How many of you have taken your driving test yet? Anyone? A few. Sorry, how many students have taken their driving test? Not many. People often say that possibly the driving test is the first time that people in your sort of position have come up against the very real possibility you might fail. That's not a good reason not to take a driving test. And similarly, there is that fear that people were not necessarily applying to Oxford or Cambridge because they don't want the indignity of failing. Well, let's address that. The only absolute certainty in this world, in this situation, is that you won't get an offer of a place if you don't apply. That will prove nothing. Apply. It's not, and you don't get a place, it's not personal. It's not personal because we're told by Oxford and Cambridge that thousands, 5,000, 6,000 people each year apply, don't get a place, and then go on to get the grades that they would have needed had they had an offer. There is a much greater number of people who are intellectually capable of thriving in this environment than there are places. So if you apply and don't get a place, it is not your fault. It's not a failure on your part, but it's worth a go. It's worth a go not because it's a lottery, because it's not a lottery. The process actually works extraordinarily well in terms of sifting out people through that process, and we'll talk about that in the course of the next day and a half. It does work well, but nevertheless there are still loads more people who are really, really fantastic applicants than there are places that can be given, and that means that you could take comfort from the fact that it's not sort of a personal failure. The ratio of applicants to places actually in Cambridge and Oxford, partly because of the self-selection of people not choosing to apply, is much, much more favourable than it is, say, for history at Bristol or physiotherapy at Warwick or something. These are fantastically oversubscribed. The ratios that we talk about here are sort of 4, 5, 6 to 1. And they're not bad odds. It's not a lottery. And I worry, and I think colleagues around the GDST worry, that there's a bit of a gender element here in terms of the research suggests that there's a greater propensity of really able girls to step back from applying on sort of perfectionist grounds, on the grounds that you just don't want to, the indignity of not getting an offer. Whereas boys will just go for it. In a former life, I was in charge of university applications at Eton. Every year we had about 150 boys apply to Oxford and Cambridge. Now between you and me, not all of those were very bright. And you try and explain to them that applying was not really in anyone's interest, it just clogs up the system. So, you know, why apply? And they just look at you and grin inanely. Well, they'd look at you. They'd look at you and smile, and they'd say, well, you know, why not? It's worth a go. And yes, they're right, it is worth a go. But there is a worry that those statistics hide the fact there are a lot of people doing that. And there are an awful lot of people, possibly people like you, who have much better claims to enjoying places here, that step back because of the statistics. Don't let the statistics affect your decision. So, what are we going to do in the next day and a half? Where are we in the journey? Well, you've just finished your AS exams, or not, if you weren't taking AS exams this year, in the first sort of wave of exam reform. So we're in slightly different situations, possibly. But when you come to apply in September, October, the grades, you may not know them yet, but the grades that you'll be declaring you've got now, they're there. Your GCSEs, ASs if appropriate. Everything, you can't do anything about that. It's brilliant. You can step back. Stop worrying about all of that, at least until August. You'll be applying at the beginning of next term. So you've got a few months in which to think about what you might do to prepare. The decisions you might need to take, the research you might need to do, and the things that you could do to make your application even stronger. And they're the kinds of things we want to focus on in the course of the next day and a half. And it's amazing how quickly the time will go. And a bit like the First World War was supposed to be, it should be all over by Christmas, hopefully. So, what are we aiming to do? Well, let's start with what this weekend isn't about. Hopefully you won't be disappointed about what you were expecting. What it isn't about is the mechanics of application. There will be a bit of information, and you'll be able to ask questions when you're talking to an admissions tutor later on today. But you can get that information anywhere, and you've already got that information, and your advisors at schools will be giving you that information with no problem at all. How to apply is not really the key focus of today and tomorrow. The key focus is twofold, really. One is to give you an insight into what's behind the selection process. What are they looking for? And one of the things that we'll be trying to stress is that when they interview you, and again, this is something that's distinctive and should not worry you, that's partly why we want to discuss it in detail already tomorrow. When they interview you, they're not trying to find out so much how much you know as how teachable you are. And we'll be trying to unpack this idea that an interview is like a supervision, a tutorial at Oxford or Cambridge. It's about you working with new stuff, how you deal with that. And it's unpacking that is part of what we want to try and talk about. So unpicking interviews, what they're trying to find out is worth knowing. But mainly, I suppose, it's that middle bit. It's about giving you a flavour, a taste of what it would be like to be learning in this kind of environment. So small group tutorials, seminar type sessions peppered across the 1.5 days is really the backbone of what we're doing this weekend.